Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parlour Podcast, where we explore human flourishing in work and in life. Today on the podcast, I spoke to MindGab's friend, Dr. Charlotte Rae. Charlotte's an associate professor at the University of Sussex, where she studies the 4-day week. What's cool about Charlotte's research is, as you'll find out in the episode, is that she not only studies the subjective effects of a 4-day week, that you get from self-reported measures like levels of stress, burnout, well-being, sleep, etc. But she also studies these things objectively by scanning brains, taking blood samples, tracking sleep accurately. And I'm grateful to Charlotte because I myself used her study to transition myself from a sleep-deprived 5-day week, I remember waking up regularly at 3 a.m. with a lot of thoughts on my mind, to a more balanced and sustainable 4-day week. I'm not saying it's bliss yet, but it's my life is a lot better for it. I even got to go in one of those noisy brain scanners. And if you're at all geeky, you'll enjoy this conversation where we get into lots of things such as the effects of a 4-day week on the brain, how the default mode network helps creativity and strategic thinking, particularly for senior leaders, how sleep improves from this process, some productivity tips that apply to everybody, and a lot more. We'll go on a few little tangents that are fun and juicy and geeky, but also a lot of really practical stuff. You'll find Charlotte an absolute delight to listen to. She's so eloquent in talking about her research, and so I hope you enjoy this episode very much. So with all that said, here is Dr. Charlotte Rae. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, John.
Good to have you here. For listeners, Charlotte and I know each other very well. Charlotte works at the University of Sussex, where my wife and business partner Gabs used to work. So we all know each other very well. We also realised recently we have family in the same little village in Sussex. And today Charlotte's going to be here to talk about her research. So Charlotte, before we get into the weeds, I'm sure we'll get to geek plenty as well. Could you tell listeners a bit about what you're doing right now and how you came to be doing it, please?
Yeah, thanks, John. So, hi, listeners. I'm an academic psychologist at the University of Sussex, and for the last 4 years, my research group has been studying the 4-day working week and the effect that has on people who are working less time. That goes for both how people are getting on at work in terms of performance, but also in terms of their own well-being. And we've been taking quite a lot of well-being measures, looking from sleep, lifestyle, through to mental health, through to even physiological changes in the body and in the brain with MRI scans. But my story for how I got into this is maybe a little untraditional in that I don't have a business psychology background originally. My training was as a biological psychologist using MRI brain scanning to understand how the mind works. But when I saw the media headlines coming out a few years ago about both better well-being and better performance on a shorter working week, I just thought that's so fascinating. What is it behind those media headlines? Well, ultimately, part of it's got to be the human brain, because that's what produces work. It's what produces our feelings.
Beautiful. All right. So we'll go and delve into some of your findings. Before we do, what is it about this? Because you're so passionate about what you do. I mean, I know you just geek on brains.
Yeah.
Say for listeners, I've been a participant in Charlotte's study, so she's got pictures of my brain, sadly. What is it that you find, what makes you so passionate about it? Or what do you find, you must find something quite important about this work you do in it? What is that?
Well, from a purely selfish perspective, I think what drives me in this is just curiosity and the opportunity to learn something new every single day. And on the academic side, of course, there's research findings there where I get to see, well, what's the exact % change in burnout, or which exact areas of the brain are shifting. But it's also been an amazing learning journey for me to form these wonderful collaborations with our participants. So how this works is we collaborate with employers who want to trial a shorter working week. And we've also in recent times, we've been studying a group of people who aren't changing working hours for what we scientifically call a control group. But forging these relationships with these people who are in the real world outside of the university and getting to hear really quite personal stories about the journeys that they're going on, the changes to working practices that are happening to accommodate shorter working weeks, or for our control employers, they're not changing working hours, but they're nevertheless still interested in applying some of these learnings around, time management. And it's just fascinating every time we work with someone new. There are commonalities in challenges that businesses are experiencing or that individual staff face, email overload, too much time in meetings. But there's also the unique things that happen in each employer that, of course, play out differently for their different types of work. So every day it's so richly stimulating for me to hear about what people's lives are really like.
And you started describing it a bit there, but I thought that let's just jump in. Can you describe to listeners maybe about the study you're doing, name the institute and whatnot, but make sure that we understand how the study broadly works. Perhaps after that we can get into the findings. You've got your control group who I get to a 5-day week, and then you've got your 4-day week participants. So talk us through the kind of study and the methodology.
Mm. Yeah. So for both groups of employers, before we get underway with any sort of changes, we first run a couple of what we call baseline weeks. So this is before any changes are made to working hours. And this is incredibly valuable data to get us a sense of what are people's scores looking like in terms of performance at work, in terms of well-being, in terms of sleep and so on, before any changes are made. And during that baseline period, we usually run some training with staff, typically takes the form of a focus group style activity, where we chat through what working life is like at the moment and any productivity blockers or things that they already have a sense are kind of slowing them down or frustrating them or limiting outputs and deliverables. And then I share some insights that we've learned from studying employers who were switching to shorter working weeks, where you're suddenly time restricted, you've got less time available, but you typically still want to produce the same output or service, but in less time. And that means finding behavioural efficiencies. Some of it, this is, technological, potentially, of course, the spectre of AI. But ultimately, I realised quite a lot of these changes are quite behavioural in nature, whether that's on an individual level, your own habits and routines, or interacting together in teams and kind of social cohesion and collaboration. So then in these focus groups, we then chat through some of these learnings from kind of previous case studies of shorter working week employers and staff. And then we help staff to kind of co-create, right, what's your version of this? What does your menu look like for some changes that you're going to have a go at implementing as part of the trial? So the aim, especially for the shorter working week group there, is to give some practical approaches to make that transition a bit easier rather than just, right, next week, we've only got 80% of time available and we're going to have to get everything done. Then we go into the trial phase and we measure for a period of 12 weeks. And that's because it does take a good few weeks for some of these new routines and habits to bed in. And I do encourage the employers and the staff to have a little bit of an experimental mindset, not just because they're taking part in a research study, but because it's a live experiment in their own business to tweak processes and to really work out what is it that's going to work longer term in changed working practices. And then at the end of the 12 weeks, we then write a report for the business, sharing back scores from what we've been measuring around how people feel they're getting on at work and how they're doing in terms of well-being.
So both the groups have this productivity training,
That's right. Yeah,
time and the 4-day week group, the control and the 4-day week
that's
group.
right. Yeah.
You have ongoing questionnaires throughout and the report at the end, but also explain to listeners at the beginning. I'm speaking as someone who's had my blood taken before and after. Sleep tracker at the beginning and at the end.
um,
Actually, that it's not just a Fitbit; it's a far more accurate version of a
Mm,
Fitbit. So, and there's also a very noisy brain scan at the
mm,
beginning and
mm.
and other tests. I remember having some interoception tests as well. So tell listeners a bit about I guess those are quite objective things as well as the subjective reporting. The
Exactly.
objective measures are at the beginning and end. Tell us a
That's
bit about
right.
that before we get
Yeah, yeah.
reading.
So this is something that's quite unique about our research project compared to other studies that have been done on the 4-day week. So listeners may have heard of some of these really big scale international trials that have been running for several years. And the UK has actually been the largest in terms of the number of both employers and employees taking part in these big international cohort trials. In the UK, those have largely been coordinated by the 4-day week Foundation. And those are hugely valuable for giving us that diversity of sample, but they are all self-report led data trials. And what's slightly different about the Sussex programme is we take more biological metrics, which are objective. One of our HR managers from one of our employers said, "You can't fake a brain scan." The aim here is to really complement the subjective self-report that the participants tell us how they're feeling with what is objectively going on in terms of people's physiology, sleep, brain function, and the immune system.
Nice. So maybe that would be a good kind of segue to discuss what some of the, if you take the before and after
Mm.
picture of my brain and many of it, or the picture of um, the control at the end and the 4-day participant at the end. Can you talk us through some of the differences that you're seeing between
Yeah.
those?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. Our analyses so far are suggesting there are signatures in the brain of a shorter working week. So we're still wrapping up the control group data collection, finishing that in a couple of months' time. But already from the sneak peeks that we've taken at the participants in the 4-day week group, we've seen a couple of really interesting things happening. So firstly, when we look at mental health, there's an area in the brain called the insular cortex, which processes sensations associated with bodily stress, like a fast heartbeat or shallow breathing. And we can see that the more someone's anxiety improves after switching to a shorter working week, the more that their insular cortex activity is enhanced and increases after the 4-day week, so before and after. So
So that increase in the insular cortex, is that the ability to know that one is stressed?
exactly, to more accurately perceive those bodily
Yeah, yeah,
sensations
yeah.
rather than a kind of like diffuse sense of like, there's something that I'm
Yeah,
feeling and
yeah.
I'm not sure what
I
it
had
is.
clients this morning say, "I'm in a funk,"
Yeah,
but couldn't quite, she's in a funk, so she can't describe the funk. That's how we all feel when we're in a funk. I love that expression. But here you're saying that at the end of the trial, the 4-day week people, they would be able to be slightly more accurate than "I'm in a funk." They'd be able to say, "I notice my heart rate has changed," or whatever.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that seems to be the more that someone's brain shifts in that way, the more that their anxiety goes down, probably because there's less of that sort of diffuse, intrusive stress feeling and more, oh, okay, I've noticed my heart beating. Oh, that's, you know, because I'm stressed. Oh,
Right.
and I don't have to worry about it.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so that's one change we've seen. There's another change we've seen in a network in the brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network is a really fascinating set of regions in the brain. So it's called the default mode because it's literally the default mode that our brain goes into whenever we're not engaged in an attentionally demanding task. So, for example, if you're sitting on the train just looking out of the window and enjoying the view, or maybe taking the dog for a walk. Or for me, it happens in the shower quite a lot. So these are scenarios where you're sort of somewhat on autopilot and your brain's prefrontal cortex isn't being pulled into a specific task. And this network in the brain, we know that it's associated with creativity and with problem solving. And we think what's going on there is that what you do when you step into the default mode network is you create the literal brain space. It's a particular area in the middle of the prefrontal cortex for all this unconscious problem solving that's been going on at the back of your mind to actually come into consciousness. But in order for your brain to do that, you have to kind of clear the junk out the way of emails, meeting, report writing.
So,
So it's such a crucial network, but it's not one we necessarily spend much time in nowadays. And excitingly, we've seen that the connectivity of the default mode network is enhanced after 12 weeks
mm,
of working a 4-day week.
so as you know, I'd like to go and geek into this a little bit more. Listeners, Semi, forgive me here. I'm unapologetically doing it. So first of all, let's define a few things. A network in the brain, am I right, is basically a collaboration between several structures in the brain.
That's right. It's a set of connected regions.
And in this case, we're saying that the default mode network, is it essentially, in layman's terms, is it essentially mind wandering, or what
That's right.
happens to your mind when you're not doing anything particular with your mind?
That's right, exactly. And on the one hand, that might feel like sort of being lazy, or it might feel like your brain isn't working particularly hard. But in fact, all of the brain is working quite hard most of the time. But we're constantly cycling in and out of these kind of networks, where at any one time we might have more dominant
Yeah,
activity
yeah.
in a particular set of regions. And in order for the default mode network to kind of come into prominence, you need to dial down your activity in other brain areas.
And so, is it fair to say that the default mode network at its best is the thing that means that we have epiphanies in the shower? It's
Yes.
like, that thing where, I mean, particularly I've worked in an industry that tends to count time. Um, we don't, but most in this job do. And, um, and I've always thought, yeah, but like I have great ideas in the shower or on dog walk.
Mm,
Those don't count as my time,
mm.
and whatever. So the default mode network is the thing to thank when we're having insights out of nowhere seemingly, but actually it's funny that they all tend to happen. In the shower is the classic kind of story we tell, right?
Yeah, those light bulb moments. And I had one at the weekend whilst gardening at my allotment. I was like wheeling a wheelbarrow of mulch, and then I had to put the wheelbarrow down suddenly to get out my phone and write this idea down, because I realized that we could use AI large language models to process a particular type of our data in a
Yeah.
new way.
Mm.
And that had just seemingly popped out of nowhere. Yeah,
But you'd created the conditions.
exactly. Yeah.
The soil was fertile for that idea
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
Um, the thing I want to bring up here is I've spoken to you about this. I'm sure I've mentioned it briefly on the podcast before, but I'm an avid meditator. I've probably been doing it 10 to 15 years, and I've been on several 10-day silence. I've probably spent 40 to 40 days around in total silence, meditating 11 hours a day. And some mad things happen to the mind when one does that. There's a famous book. In England, it's called The Science of Meditation, and in the States, it's called Altered Traits, because the long-term studies of monks and of non-meditators, and they find that the brains of monks are basically pretty different. Um, and they call them altered traits because meditation doesn't just lead to these little blissful feelings; it leads to permanent trait
Mm,
changes. And there's loads of stuff in this that's relevant, I'm sure, but the main one is they talk about the default mode network a lot. And actually, they talk about it in studies of people on magic mushrooms as well. I'm thinking of Michael
yes.
Pollan's book on psilocybin. Um, and the pollen story and the mindfulness story are quite similar. So it's Dr. Richie Davidson. And um, they say that when people meditate a lot, particularly mindfulness meditation, I'm talking about, that activity in the default mode network reduces. So I've
Mm,
got a few quotes here from a podcast with his institute recently, and I thought I'd put them past you, and
mm.
you can help me to set it straight, because they don't portray it like this, but it's almost like, to me in the past, my interpretation, I've not interpreted it as the creative engine, which I think is a really beautiful way to think of it. I've seen it as the thing that causes me to ruminate, that causes me to stress. So I'll read one thing here. He says, the more the default mode is, he says, the more this goes on, so the more the default mode network's like on it, basically, the more problems it creates. Abnormal activity in this network is linked to a range of psychological disorders, ranging from anxiety and depression to attention disorders. like ADHD. So how can you to reconcile on the one side the creative mind wandering I totally get, and on the other side that feeling of overwhelm I've happened because my brain is
Mm.
telling these mad stories all the time, and I'm just trying to let the thoughts pass me by, but they've got a grip of me.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, John. It's really a helpful example there of a kind of an illustration of a spectrum, really. So I think what we're getting at is the idea of balance, and it can be that if you're at one end of the spectrum of spending a lot of time in the default mode network as opposed to other sorts of networks in the brain. So, for example, the executive control network is one that's associated with kind of quite task-driven behavior, say like, focusing on writing a report. If you're spending a lot of time in default mode network and not cycling in and out flexibly through the day into these different state spaces, then that is what can be associated with sort of getting into, a rumination loop of going deeper and deeper and deeper in a bit of a mind wandering circle rather than coming back out of the default mode network to engage in some other, say like gently distracting task that might take you away from some of those worries and kind of ruminative thought patterns. And I think what we're seeing on the 4-day week study is just a kind of rebalancing of spending lots of time in one particular type of network necessarily.
Yeah.
So when we're at work, we're on task quite a lot of the time, and we're not probably spending much time in default mode. And then the scenarios that you've just outlined there, people might be spending so much time in the default mode network that is unhelpful.
Mm.
So just finding that happy balance and happy medium where you spend enough time in default mode that you get creative flashes of insight, but everything in balance.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. He goes on to say every time you bring your awareness back to what you're doing and who you're with, you deactivate this network, i.e. the DMN. So that suggests, but that's the same as what you're saying when you're highly focused on a task.
Mhm.
Essentially being present is
Yeah.
probably that fulcrum where you're in balance, probably is
Mhm.
being
Mhm.
present. And that is that you're not overly executive and not overly in default. You're cycling between them, or there's a healthy balance between the two.
And attending both externally and
Yeah,
internally.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, beautiful. That makes a lot of sense. I'm also thinking of how a lot of the work we've done with teams, particularly CEOs and founders who need to be doing very strategic work, they're on it all day long. They'll say the quotes we hear constantly are, "We're firefighting,
Yeah.
we're babysitting," or hand holding is another one, and we're stuck in the weeds. And because they're constantly on in that detail mode, that's probably highly executive in your
Yes.
language, and what it's lacking, but their jobs should be strategic, and yet they have no time for creativity to be strategic. And it's odd because this would suggest that if we're thinking of people in really strategic roles, they should be spending time in their work week, potentially going on some walks
Yes.
or,
That would 100% be my recommendation. Get away from the desk, get away from your usual working environment, and give yourself some quiet time without devices.
mm, yeah,
Mm.
without the and on the devices thing, because obviously there's so much going on there. Is there anything I'm thinking of that. I'm also thinking of how we've described walks, we've described being outdoors. Is there anything about, the visual side of this, that when my eyes are literally targeted in on something, about a meter from my face, that has a different effect on the brain than if I've got a whole view of a mountain in front of me or the sea. Like I have more expansive thoughts in those moments than I do in these. Is there anything, either in, the broader research or just your intuition about how we spend our time and it affecting this? It's not just work or not work, from my understanding.
Mm. Mm. So in terms of the visual system, when you look at a wider field of view, um, certainly that will lead to different patterns of activity. The visual cortex occupies a huge amount of territory in the human brain, because the primate evolutionary line is very visual dominant, as opposed to some other mammals where other senses might be more dominant, like audition or smell. So a huge portion of the human brain is visual, with only smaller amounts for olfaction, that's smelling, and auditory processing. And as you go kind of further along the visual, we call them the visual streams in the brain, where the most basic early visual areas process more elemental features. But as you progress more along that area of visual cortex, that processes more sort of scene integration. And then this is all along the temporal lobe. And as you get further down the temporal lobe, then you come into integrating that with memory and kind of scene encoding in the sense of forming long-term memories in the brain. So stepping into a visual environment where you've got a more complex visual scene, that is going to be activating slightly different areas of the brain.
And by complex, is for example, a panorama more complex than me looking at my screen right now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And that would therefore stimulate different networks in the brain.
Yes. Yeah. And kind of on different onward cascades of activity potentially.
Yeah, because it was interesting to me that it was gardening as well. I know that's not a large panorama, but it's certainly larger than being on a screen. Although it's equally like a different form of attention, right? Gardening and it being manual and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I am curious about, I know your productivity training talks about how we spend our time at work. Have you got any instincts as to how, because we could also waste our Fridays, right? Or like they could not be helping our default mode network. I know they do on average from the studies, but I'm wondering what activities or non-activities help most on that Friday off kind of thing.
Yeah. So to more formally assess this, several working time reduction studies have asked participants to fill out what's called a time use diary. So, and you kindly did one for us. So this asks literally, how do you spend your time? So every 15 minutes, you write down what is it that you're doing. And then from that, this very rich data we can convert into, numerical totting up how much time you're spending under different categories. And fascinatingly, when you give people time away from work with no loss of salaries, and that's the form of the 4-day week that we're talking about here, rather than say like a compressed hours or a part-time 4-day week. So far from what we can see, they tend to use it for very restorative activities. Sometimes they're doing that directly on the day off itself. So dog walks, exercise classes, coffees with friends. Sometimes they're using that time to do chores and domestic labour that they were otherwise previously doing on the weekend. And then we can see time use changing at the weekend, where they're now spending less time on chores, food shopping, etc., because they're getting that done during the week now, and then having a much more leisure-filled weekend where there really is that rest and restoration around personal hobbies and leisure, but also time with friends and family, all of which we know is so important for mental health. And then, of course, mental health is so important for keeping you in work and performing well at work.
Yeah, of course, it's such a vicious or virtuous cycle at that point. So we've discussed the creative, we've started with the brain and have discussed the creative and strategic benefits. You've just started going into mental health. What are your findings there?
Well, unsurprisingly, people feel healthier and happier, but specifically when it comes to symptoms of poor mental health. So here we're talking about symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety. When we look on the average group level, this is statistically significantly improving in the 4-day week group. But it's interesting, there's a bit of a subgroup effect going on here where most of our participants, well, all of our participants are people who are in employment. So they're well enough to be in employment, first and foremost, and they're well enough to not be off sick from poor mental health. So generally, people aren't doing too bad at baseline to start with. But that's not to say you can't still get a small improvement. Where we see the big improvement is in a subgroup of people who were actually struggling and have slightly worse mental health compared to their other colleagues. And those are the people who the 4-day week seems to be most powerful for in terms of improving mental health, intuitively, because they've got more room for improvement.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
maybe the group that's already doing all right, they're somewhat regulated. So it's not that
Mm.
they can do better, but the system's not out of whack. Whereas here, I'm sure, I wonder how long it takes as well, but it probably takes several weeks for them to start to re-regulate themselves.
Yeah. So the mental health symptoms we measure 3 months apart. So this subgroup of people, we're seeing those improvements after 3 months. But we also take some weekly measures that are looking at burnout. And this is specifically work-related burnout. And that is fascinating because we can see some really quite radical improvements in a relatively short space of time, where most of the improvement in burnout seems to be happening in the first 4 weeks. And then it doesn't completely plateau. You still continue to get a little benefit to reducing burnout week on week on week on week and week. But most of the action seems to happen in the first
Hmm,
month or so.
hmm. And how do you, when you're sharing these findings with us, are these based on the questionnaires or is it based on the objective measures?
So the mental health and the burnout are from the self-report questionnaires, yeah.
What did you find in my blood and my sleep tracking?
So we haven't analysed everyone's blood yet. They're all on ice in the freezer. That's the technicality around you basically analyse everyone on a plate at once. So
Okay.
later in the summer, we're going to have a lot of pipetting to do. But on the sleep, again, that's quite fascinating where changes
Just
happen.
before you get into sleep on the
Yeah.
blood one, so you
Mm.
don't have the findings yet, but could you tell us what you if you've got any hypotheses? I'm assuming
Cool.
it's about cortisol levels or something. But
Well, so we haven't actually checked cortisol. We would like to in a future study. The ideal way to measure cortisol is in saliva samples.
okay,
And we need to get you to spit into a tube 4 times for the first hour after you wake up every 15 minutes.
okay, it's
Um,
quite
and with
intense.
everything else we were doing on the study, we
Yeah,
thought
that's a
we
bit
can't
much.
ask you to do that as
I
well.
think I'd have found that a bit much. Yeah, but
Um,
what are you looking for, or however you term that in
Absolutely.
the
So
blood?
what we're looking at in the blood samples are the presence in the bloodstream of these molecules called inflammatory
Ah,
cytokines.
yeah.
So these are markers that in all of our blood that indicate how hard the immune system is working.
Mm.
And they're part of the body's natural immune response. So if you get a virus infection, coughs, cold, flu, then these increase a lot in your blood. And they're basically the immune system kicking into action. So in that respect, they're a good thing. However, they can also be chronically slightly elevated in your blood for kind of psychosocial reasons. So if you're really stressed, if you have a bad night's sleep, shift work, these are chronically elevated in your blood because your immune system is sort of on high alert in a systemic manner. And we know that that is now a risk factor for both depression and for dementia. And that's because these molecules can get out of the blood into the brain, and then they cause an inflammatory response in brain tissue. And we don't fully understand the exact biological mechanisms of that yet, but we can see that these markers are more common in people with depression and dementia. So our hypothesis in our study is that if people are less stressed and they're sleeping better, then that might have caused some physiological changes in the body that lead to reduced inflammation.
Yeah, the inflammatory markers should go down.
Mm,
Interesting.
yes.
I was thinking just the other day about how we feel about money sometimes, and of course, if I'm actually stressed from a real pain that's caused to my body, um, I I would have inflammatory markers go up because the
Mm,
body is trying to fix itself, basically. But if I have perceived stress, which might actually not be true, it might simply be projection, a delusion, whatever's going on in my mind here as I'm anticipating pain that might never come.
Mm.
I guess that's where the body still can generate some of those inflammatory markers when it kind of needs not, because the fear of, or the pain is actually an assumption or a hypothesis at this point. It's not real. So
Yeah.
that's happening there. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And so this illustrates those very interwoven links between the mind, the brain, and the body, because though those feelings of stress are happening psychologically in your mind, and of course the biological substrate for that is the brain. And the brain is in constant dynamic conversation with the body, because the brain sends all these nerve signals down to the organs, and the organs send signals back up to the brain via those nerves. And then that generates onward cascades to other biological systems
Mm,
in the body.
mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Amazing. That's really helpful. So tell us about the sleep trackers. What
Mm.
in those?
So, firstly, when we ask people to just self-report, how do you feel you've been sleeping? Again, it's fascinating to see just how quickly that can change for people, because within the first couple of weeks of switching to a shorter working week, people are reporting noticeably better sleep quality. And then when we look at the sleep trackers, and we also ask people to keep a sleep diary to tell us what time did you go to bed last night, what time are you getting up, we can see that people are sleeping for 13 minutes more after switching to the 4-day week. So that could be because they're drifting off to sleep more easily at night. It could be because they're waking up in the night less with those kind of nighttime rumination worries about the to-do list. So that's one of the next steps for the trackers, is to look at, well, where are those 13 minutes coming from?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to remember back to how I felt when I first started on a 4-day week, which I've stuck to. I don't work Fridays anymore, for context. So because I was sleeping really badly at the time, and I felt particularly overwhelmed at work. And I think the main feeling I have, and this might segue us into another finding I know you've got, which was around psychological distance, I think you called it. But essentially what I noticed is that on normally when I was working a full time, like on a Saturday, I'm basically thinking about work. And by Sunday, I'm ready to relax, but I'm already anticipating Monday. Whereas bringing that forward to Friday meant that by Saturday, I was relaxed. And therefore,
Um,
on Saturday and Sunday, I would sleep better.
uh,
Because I would sleep better then, I would probably sleep better in the early part of the week as well. And that is where I felt like I got a little bit of a grip on sleep. It wasn't quite a problem, but it was certainly becoming borderline
hmm.
a problem for me. And that's how I experienced it personally. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Yeah. So it's what we call psychological detachment.
Attachment.
Um, how easy do you find it to switch off from work, to detach yourself from that to-do list? And our graph looks really interesting here. Again, week by week, we see that steadily improving. People finding it easier and easier to switch off. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got sleep, well-being, creativity, and the last one might be productivity. I know you've got.
Mm. Yeah. So productivity can be actually quite tricky to manage, to measure objectively, especially when you've got multiple employers who are doing different kinds of work. So what productivity means for you might be different for someone else. So for our architect's firm, it was number of design steps completed in an hour. For the customer call center, it was, how long did they spend on the phone with each client? So those are objective markers that we encouraged each employer to sort of reflect on before they go into the trial. What would be a sector-specific metric for you that's relevant to the type of work that you do? And sometimes we analyse that for them. But because they're not easily comparable across different employers within a study, we wanted to find an approach to measuring productivity that would work cross-cutting across all sorts of different job roles. And so we use this exercise where we encourage staff to set themselves 5 work goals or tasks for the coming week ahead at the start of each week. And then at the end of the week, we ask them to tell us how well they feel they met their 5 goals. Essentially, did they tick off their to-do list?
Mm.
So this approach has some pros and cons to it. One of the benefits is that it really encourages people to plan ahead and to use this as a little bit of a structuring exercise, given that they need to think carefully about their time usage.
The control group do this as well.
They do, yeah, yeah. And so there we're looking to see, well, is there any benefit to the sort of time restriction of a 4-day week above and beyond having some time management advice?
Yeah, because I was going to say the reason I was asking is simply because I think I found that the act of doing that exercise itself increased my task completion rate or something. So you'd want the control to be doing it as well, so they both might see mild increases, albeit
Exactly.
4-day weeks far greater.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And that helps us to isolate, well, what's the effect of a 4-day week specifically on productivity, rather than just engaging in an exercise and having researchers give you some techniques and some measures to fill out. So, as I say, we're still finishing off the control group. So we haven't seen what's there yet to understand just how big is the kind of benefit to the 4-day week group. But what we have seen is, on average, there's an increase of 8% on that goal attainment in the 4-day week group. Yeah. That's on average. So some people improve more, some people stay the same. We've had 1 or 2 employers where it went down slightly.
Okay, where it went down slightly, yeah.
Mm.
I was going to say, what are what are some findings that are not such great adverts for working a 4-day week? Have you found anything where you've gone, that's a clear downside of a 4-day week, or not?
Yeah, well, I think everything we've just said highlights the nuances of the individual journeys. So mostly what we've talked about has been where I'm telling you what's happened on average across 30 or so employers. But that masks those very individual journeys and trajectories. So we've had a minority of employers who found it harder to adapt the working week, or found their productivity wasn't maintained, and they have tended to be the ones who discontinued. And it's been for a range of reasons. We had, for example, one company who went for like a full, what we call a 5th day stoppage. So they closed entirely on a Friday.
Oh, right. Rather than staggering staff.
Exactly, having staff off on different days. But their client base was still working 5 days. And so for them, I think maybe a more suitable model would have been having staff off on different days. And so they found their customer service kind of scores, which would be a productivity metric, slipping, because their response times became slower on that day.
Yeah, okay.
So thinking carefully, in the preparation and what model is right for you and your sector to really tailor this. I think that's one message I'd like to send. 4-day week's a good catchphrase, but it conjures up lots of assumptions about we're closed on Fridays, and it's so customizable to what's appropriate for you.
It's a shorthand, really. I mean, I because then I know people who do 9-day fortnights, and that way half the team has Friday A off and half the team has Friday B off, for example. But then you can also have half the team works Monday to Thursday and half the team works Tuesday to Friday, or there's other ways of doing it that might have prevented that particular participant organisation of yours from having.
And in more recent times, I've seen greater diversity of models coming into the trials. So we've also had some people doing 2 half days, and some people going for 5 shorter days instead. Yeah.
And I started desperately trying to work a 5-day week, a 4-day week, where I've ended up, I think, is more a compressed format. I accidentally, I don't know if it's difficult. I wonder if I was doing this a lot before anyway, but I am tending to start ever so slightly earlier and end ever so slightly later. I don't think it actually does amount to a full day, but that's been my experience. But Friday mornings are rosy now. I wake up later. I go to the gym a bit later rather than my normal like 6 a.m. slot. So that's been quite transformative for me. Thank you.
Mm. Mm.
Your accountability was helpful. Feeling a part of an experiment, I think, helped me enormously.
Yeah, that's something we've heard quite a bit of. Just taking part in the program has been useful as a structure
Yeah.
um, to
For
take.
habit formation,
Yeah, yeah, and
like
the
I
goal
felt
setting is part of that as well, I think.
absolutely, and
Mm.
I felt like I'd be letting you all down who are doing your jobs if I didn't stick to it, and that was just really helpful. And I've not looked back since, and we're quite a few months later now. Maybe a good way to start bringing us towards a close would be to mention that whether people are in a 4-day week or a 5-day week, you're essentially finding that it is possible to become more to become more efficient or productive in the workplace. What are some of the piece of advices you've got for people for this? I know some might be in your productivity training, some might be a bit broader from your experience. What advice have you got for people?
If you're lucky enough to have a 4-day week, great. But if you don't, you can still apply lots of these
Mm,
time management techniques. And the motivation here may be slightly different. It might be just, managing overwhelm and heavy workloads. It might be because instead of taking time away from work, you want to spend a little bit more time at work on, say, training and development. Or it could be for your business leaders who you mentioned earlier, John, time on strategy. So time away from the firefighting to work on some bigger picture stuff. Or let's say if it's a knowledge economy business, engaging in some learning around AI and kind of tooling up. So none of it is rocket science.
no,
But
that's what's kind of beautiful about it. I think they're small,
yeah,
but they make a difference, don't they?
exactly. Yeah. So what we're talking about are kind of behavioral tweaks. So on an individual level, this can be around your own kind of habits, around how you prioritize the high value tasks versus getting drawn into potentially easier tasks or things that just draw your attention. So email is a big thing here, or for some it can be Slack or like Teams, like internal messaging. So because these messages arrive instantly and they're often people trying to reach you for help or advice or to get you to do a task for them, it can be quite tempting to engage in prompt responses and instantly jumping onto helping people. And often that's part of our job to help our colleagues, but it's rarely your job to monitor an email inbox unless you're a kind of
Mm,
professional secretary administrator.
yeah.
So something I often recommend to employers and to staff is to engage in messaging in a really intentional manner. So think about which periods in the day are you going to do it and engage in processing messages as opposed to just sort of reading or browsing, and then close the program in between. And you could have a chat with your line manager about how long is appropriate for you to sort of go dark in order to work on something that needs your full attention. So for me, that's a piece of academic writing or say, producing a report for one of our participating employers. For you, it's what your quotes actual job is of your core outputs and deliverables.
And I'd add to that something I've seen in self-managed teams is one of two things. One is the team decides that like we turn Slack off between 12 and 2, and that's just to like just understand those are off hours or whatever it might be. And another one is just that everyone shares their user manual of themselves. So that they call it a manual of me. And I might say I don't look at my email before 10:30. And then the team just know that that's kind of how
Yeah.
I work. Now, if anyone's got a real objection to that, I might change my ruling, my guidelines slightly. But having those is really key, right? To have time where you're not at the mercy of other people's needs and notifications a lot, as opposed to deep work that I want to be doing.
Yeah. So we refer to that as like communal deep work periods where every you have a team conversation in order to work out around your user manual preferences, like where in the day is our sweet spot for deep work, where we all commit to supporting each other in turning off our messaging.
Mm, mm.
Mm.
You had some stuff. What really helped me, it was a reminder. It was a habit I totally let go, and that was around meetings, diaries, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so something we hear a lot from knowledge economy businesses is spending so much time in meetings that you can't get the actual work done. And this is something I found incredibly helpful myself for my own working life and practice is I pre-allocate certain slots in my diary that are open for anyone to book into for a meeting, but I block off certain periods in a routine manner, you know. So Monday mornings and Wednesday mornings are completely blocked off for anyone to book into for a meeting. They're my kind of power hours where I'm most productive to get on with a task. But that still leaves enough kind of flexibility for people to book in with me and hopefully find a place where we align.
Yeah, and I found even just using tools like Calendly really helpful because I send a link and that makes it slightly less likely that I drop my own boundaries because the robot kind of does it for me. That
Yeah.
said, I've got to say I slip. This is a boundary I put in and it erodes for 2 months and I put it back in and it slowly erodes and it's kind of a journey of resetting that boundary time and time again. For me, I wonder if it's more the case for people who have a lot of client work
Yeah. Yeah.
that might happen, or particularly paid, fee-based hours kind of thing.
Mm. I think that you customize it for what's
Yeah.
appropriate for you. And if you're very client facing, it might be that it's just an hour on a Monday and an hour on a Friday that you block off
Mm,
from client
yeah, yeah,
contact.
amazing.
Whereas if you're someone like me, an academic, then you can block off more time. That's just appropriate to whatever your
Yeah,
role
and I
is.
think
Yeah.
you actually have a personal ritual you have, don't you, that at the end of each day, you have some time dedicated to email so that
Yeah.
not checking it all day long because you know you've got your slot later in the day where you'll do that.
Exactly. So that's my personal habit, and that's what works well for me. With my user manual and my circadian preference, like 3, 4 p.m., I can't. I'm too tired to like do the deep work, but I can manage the kind of lower level admin. So I actually block off 4 to 5 p.m. in my calendar every day to have a block of processing messages. And by doing it every day, it means I keep on top of it. And it's rare that someone has to wait more than like a day or two for a response. And that's appropriate for me as an academic. It might be if you're in more of a frontline facing role, maybe a couple of times a day might be more appropriate.
We're heading towards the end of your circadian rhythm slot. Like, start going offline a bit, I think. So let's start to wrap up. For any advice briefly for anyone who is looking, an organization perhaps who's looking to start a 4-day week, like, yeah,
Absolutely,
anything
yeah.
you
So,
suggest?
there's what I call the aspiration versus reality gap.
Mm, mm.
So there are quite a lot of progressive businesses who want to do things differently, who've seen the data coming out, or maybe there's a particular problem that they need to solve around recruitment or retention, and they think, oh, this could be a good thing, but oh my God, in practical reality, how is this going to happen? You don't have to answer all of those questions by yourself. There's so much help and support out there for you. Um, you and your staff actually do have all the answers, but what's helpful is having a facilitator to help you with that. So I would recommend looking at the resources from the 4-Day Week Foundation. They have fantastic FAQ. Of course, us here at the Sussex 4-Day Week programme, as part of taking part in the research programme, we share all of those advice and insights back to you to help you find what your flavour of it is. We benefit hugely from that collaboration because we get to study research data from you as well. But there are also specialised support services in the UK. So Autonomy are the kind of UK leaders for that if you want an even more kind of structured hand holding. And of course, so there's now all the alumni. There are hundreds of organisations in the country who have done this. And the 4-Day Week Foundation have a list of them. And maybe you work in a sector that's similar to one of our Sussex 4-Day Week alumni. So feel free to get in touch and I can kind of matchmake for you to find you your kind of peer mentor.
And then where can people find out more about you, Charlotte, your work, the team's work. If
Thanks,
they
John.
can get involved in any, because I've got to say for everyone listening, I like just really enjoyed the process of being a part of some research. Like it made the whole thing more meaningful, more likely to stick to it, really like intellectually interesting. So I would recommend if you can do a 4-day week. Like it's fun to get your brain scanned at the same. By the way, weirdly like intimate to see a picture of my brain. Like for all I know, you lied and you sent me someone else's brain. But the idea in that was my brain. I was like, oh my god, that's me.
I know, I know. I
Funny.
mean, I've been taking brain scans for over 15 years,
Yeah,
but it never gets old.
yeah, yeah.
Completely non-invasively, completely safely. We can see, and it's millimeter resolution. We can
Yeah,
see inside someone's head
yeah.
to
It's
this
so cool.
amazing organ.
Yeah,
I mean, we do make sure that we send you the right one.
yeah. I'm sure.
But there's also in the software that we sent you, there's also an option to do a 3D render, and it will put your face back on.
Wow,
So then you can check that it's your face. Yeah,
that's
but it
amazing.
doesn't. That MRI, the structural MRI, doesn't pick up hair. So
Okay. Oh, wow.
it's
So
just
that showed me what I look like bald.
yes.
That's right. Next time I see you, I'll bring my laptop and ask you to show me how
Yeah, I
that
can
works.
press the button for you. Yeah,
What's the URL people should visit or the
exactly.
email?
Yeah. So our project website is Sussex 4-day week. That's number 4.co.uk. So there's information there about other people that have taken part, some of our findings, and there's a little form that you can fill out if you're interested to join the project. And if a 4-day week isn't right for you, or a 9-day fortnight with shorter days, or that's not right for you at this point in time, then you can also join as what we call a control employer. So that's with no change to working hours. So people can express interest there, and I'll send them further
I was
info.
going to say you were at one point needing more control participants. Is that still the case?
We've caught up, so we should hit our target sample size quite soon. But of course, the more people we study, the better, because that just enriches the diversity of the insights that we get. Because as we've touched on, there are the individual journeys, the different experiences that people have in different sectors, different job roles. So the larger the sample, just the richer the insights that we get.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. So whether you're working 5 or 4 days, basically still get in touch with Charlotte.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for today. Really appreciate it. I'm sure people have got a lot from it practically, as well as just framing what it's about via a few geeky neuroscience tidbits. So it's been a good chat. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.